I was sentenced in a room that had never been meant for judgment. It was a records annex beneath the hive's mid-spire, a place where air went to die and paperwork went to be forgotten. The ceiling sagged with the weight of centuries of conduits, each one weeping condensation that dripped onto the stone like a slow, patient clock. Candles burned in glass jars along the walls, not for reverence but because the lumen strips had failed decades ago and no requisition had ever been approved to replace them. The smell was a mixture of mildew, wax, machine oil, and the faint copper tang of old blood ground into the floor by generations of boots. They made me stand on a red line painted on the stone. It was flaking, the pigment worn thin by time and feet, but I did not step outside it. No one told me not to. I had learned long before that day that obedience was safest when it was anticipatory. Across from me sat a single scribe behind a metal desk scarred with tolly, marks and devotional scratches. He wore the grey robes of the administratum, threadbare at the cuffs, and a chain of office so heavy it bowed his shoulders. His hands shook as he sorted parchment. He did not look at me. Designation, he said, voice thin as paper. I gave him my name. He paused, quill hovering, then scratched it out with a practiced flick of the wrist. When he spoke again, it was a string of numbers and letters, recited with ritual precision. That, I realized, was what I was now. The sound of it felt colder than the stone beneath my boots. The charge was read aloud, but it barely registered. Something about improper movement between hab levels, unauthorized access to restricted corridors, failure to tithe appropriate labor hours. It could have been anything. The words blurred together, each one heavy with the same weight, guilt. In the Imperium, innocence is an accounting error, and errors must be corrected. As he spoke, another clerk entered silently and placed 3 sheets of parchment on the desk. Each bore the same text, the same sigils, the same crimson seals impressed so deeply they puckered the page. The scribe pressed his signet into an ink pad and stamped them one by one, the sound sharp and final. Thump, thump. Each strike felt like it landed on my chest. He slid the papers toward me without meeting my gaze. "Your writ," he said, in triplicate. I took them with numb fingers. The parchment was thick, expensive, and smelled faintly of incense, as if sanctified to justify what it carried. My designation stared back at me, bold and impersonal. Below it, in smaller script, was the sentence. Not execution. Not labor conscription. A different word entirely. One I had only ever seen in redacted reports and whispered warnings. Pursuit. My mouth went dry. "There's been a mistake," I said, because that is what people say when the universe closes its fist around them. The scribe flinched, just slightly. His quill scratched nervously at the desk. "There are no mistakes," he replied. "Only delays in correction." He finally looked up then, and I wished he hadn't. His eyes were bloodshot and rimmed with exhaustion, but beneath that was terror, not of me, of what my papers represented. He was a man who had stamped thousands of sentences, but this one frightened him enough that his hands had not stopped shaking. "Where?" I asked. "Where will it happen?" He swallowed. "You will be notified by absence," he said, and made a sign of warding over his chest. They did not escort me out. No chains, no guards. The door behind me unlocked with a tired click, as if relieved to be done with me. I stood there for a long moment, the weight of the writs dragging at my arm, listening to the distant hum of the hive. Somewhere above, billions of lives continued in their prescribed misery. Somewhere below, things crawled that had never seen the light of a shrine lamp. And somewhere, moving toward me with deliberate slowness, was my sentence. The corridors outside were wide, designed for cargo haulers and mass transit, not men walking alone with death folded under their arm. Prayer, bells chimed at regular intervals, their tones distorted by age and echo, ringing through the metal ribs of the hive like a funeral chant that never ended. Each step I took stirred dust that tasted bitter on my tongue. The air recyclers wheezed, pushing stale breath into my lungs, and for the first time I noticed how every inhalation burned. I tried to think of what I had done. I replayed weeks and months in my mind, searching for the moment that had doomed me. A wrong turn. A door opened without authorization. A question asked of the wrong overseer. It all seemed so small now. The Imperium does not punish out of anger. It punishes out of necessity, and necessity is vast, At a transit junction, I stopped and read the writ again. My designation, the seal, the clause that made my skin crawl: exemption from immediate termination, subject to penitential pursuit for the edification of the faithful. The words were carefully chosen, polished by centuries of legal theology. I understood then that my death was meant to be seen, to be felt, to be learned from. Speed would have been wasteful. A memory surfaced, unbidden stories whispered in blocks when the lights flickered and the walls seemed too thin. Bare feet on stone. Hymns sung through broken throats. Warriors who had cast aside armor and mercy alike, seeking redemption through slaughter. I had never believed them. Belief was dangerous. Now belief felt inevitable. As I moved deeper into the hive, I became aware of a subtle change in the soundscape. The usual clatter of industry and the murmur of crowds seemed muted, as if the walls themselves were listening. Workers glanced at me and then away, their eyes drawn to the parchment in my hand as if it radiated cold. One woman made the sign of the Aquila as I passed. Another spat on the floor to ward off ill fortune. No one spoke. By the time I reached my level, my legs were trembling. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, sliding down until I was sitting on the floor amid peeling paint and the stink of old meals. I pressed the writs to my chest and laughed, a thin, hysterical sound that echoed too loudly in the small space. I had not been spared. I had been selected. That was the moment it truly settled in, heavier than fear. I was not meant to disappear quietly. I was meant to run, to be seen running, to be caught when the lesson had ripened. Somewhere in the depths of the hive, my hunters were already praying for the strength to begin. I did not sleep after the writ. I lay on my cot with my boots still on, the 3 sheets of condemnation folded under my pillow like a charm that did not protect me. The unit's walls were thin plasteel over ferrocrete, sweating with the hive's damp breath. Every so often a pipe behind the sink would knock, 2 dull taps and a hiss, like a bored attendant reminding me that the world continued its schedules even as mine collapsed. The air tasted of stale starch, rust, and the faint chemical bite of cheap disinfectant. In the dark, my thoughts had the texture of crawling things. I listened. That became my new devotion. Listening for the sound that would mean the hunt had begun. The hive is never truly quiet. There are always servitors trundling down maintenance corridors, always shift sirens moaning, always some distant argument turning to violence. But once you are waiting for a particular sound, everything else becomes a lie. Every footstep could be theirs. Every hymn could be the first note of your ending. When the shift lumen flickered on, an hour late and a shade dimmer than yesterday, I rose and went to work because routine is the only shield the small possess. My employment chit still scanned. My designation code was not yet flagged at the turnstiles. That told me something important. The administratum had not declared me a contagion to be eradicated. I was permitted to move. Permitted to be seen. Permitted to be chased. On the walk to the manufacturer annex where I filed inventory tallies, I kept the writs inside my coat. Their edges chafed my ribs with each step, a constant reminder that my fate was not a nightmare I could sweat out. The corridors were crowded with workers in drab overalls, their faces grey with fatigue and recycled air. They moved in obedient streams, heads down, eyes vacant. The hive's announcements droned from cracked speakers, prayer intervals, ration amendments, warnings about machine, spirits offended by improper tool handling. A child cried somewhere, and no one reacted. I watched for arbits, for enforcers, for any sign of the usual machinery of punishment. There was none. That in itself was a sign. The Imperium loves spectacle, but it also loves separation of duties. If the writ had marked me for some public flogging, the enforcers would already have been waiting with batons and cameras. If it had marked me for immediate conscription, a press gang would have pinned me to the wall and slapped a uniform on my back. But pursuit belonged to another office entirely, one that did not announce itself with klaxons. In the annex, the foreman handed me a slate and barked numbers as if nothing had changed. He was a thick-necked man with a Vox grill bolted into his jaw, each word buzzing with static. I nodded and went to my station between a stack of ration manifests and a rusting cogitator bank that was older than my grandparents. The keys were worn smooth by millions of inputs. The screen flickered and stuttered, spitting out lines of text like phlegm. I began to work because hands moving are hands not shaking. Hours passed in a haze of ink and oil. The annex smelled of hot metal, damp paper, and human sweat trapped beneath layers of synthetic fabric. The sounds were relentless, stamping machines, clacking keys, the distant roar of presses. The rhythm of it should have soothed me, should have buried my thoughts under repetition. It did not. Somewhere near the end of the shift, the prayer bells rang, not the tinny recorded chimes the annex used to signal sanctioned pauses, but real bells, deep and resonant, vibrating through the walls. Everyone froze. It was instinctive, like animals going still when a predator passes overhead. The foreman lifted his head, the vox in his jaw crackling with a half-formed curse that died before it became sound. The bells rang again. Closer. No alarms followed. No emergency lumen. No shouting. Just the bells, and under them, something else. Voices, raw and hoarse, carrying a hymn that did not belong to any sanctioned shift chant. It was not the smooth, practiced chorus of shrine attendants. It was the sound of throats that had been used for screaming more than singing. The words were indistinct, swallowed by distance and echo, but the fervor was unmistakable. I felt it then, not in my ears but in my chest. A pressure, like the air had thickened into a hand and was slowly tightening around my ribs. My breath caught. My fingers went numb on the cogitator keys. Judgment made physical. I stood too quickly, knocking my stool back. The scrape was loud in the sudden hush, and a dozen heads turned toward me. Their eyes were flat with fear, not curious, as if they already knew that whatever was coming did not care who it trampled. Back to work. The foreman barked automatically, but his voice wavered. His hand went to the chain of keys at his belt, as if that could unlock him from what was approaching. The hymn continued, drifting closer along the main corridor outside the annex. Between verses, I heard another sound, soft at first, then sharper as the distance closed. Footsteps. Not the heavy tread of armored boots. Not the shuffle of labor clogs. Something different. A scrape that made my teeth itch, as if metal brushed stone without padding. Bare steel against the hive's floors. I knew, with a certainty that made me sick, that they were coming for me. The rits under my coat suddenly felt like they were burning. My designation, printed and sealed, might as well have been painted on my forehead in luminous ink. I imagined those hunters, women stripped of armor and rank, skin cross-hatched with scars, eyes fixed on absolution, moving through the hive like a procession of knives. I had never seen them. The stories in the hab blocks had been enough. The annex doors creaked. A clerk peered through the glass panel, her face pale beneath the grime, and shook her head once before backing away as if retreating from a fire. No one told us to evacuate. No Vox command came. The administratum did not interfere with another officer's ritual. The Imperium is a machine of compartmentalized cruelty. Each cog turns in its appointed way, indifferent to the flesh it grinds. The foreman swallowed and stepped toward me, eyes narrowing. He had noticed my panic. He had noticed my earlier sleeplessness, the way I flinched at every bell. Foremen are trained to smell trouble the way dogs smell rot. You, he said, pointing with a trembling finger. Out, now. For a heartbeat, I thought he meant to protect the annex. To hand me over to whatever walked the halls and save the rest of his quota. Then I saw the calculation in his eyes, the desperate hope that sacrificing one worker might spare the others. It was not cruelty. It was survival, bureaucratic and banal. I did not give him the satisfaction. I bolted. The annex erupted behind me, shouts, chairs scraping. The foreman's Vox grill crackling as he barked orders that no one followed. I pushed through the crowd, elbows striking ribs, hands grabbing at my coat. Someone cursed. Someone tried to hold me. I tore free and ran into the corridor, my boots pounding the metal walkway. The hymn was louder here, echoing down the long passage like a blade drawn slowly from a sheath. The air smelled different in scents, but not the sweet kind burned in sanctioned shrines. This was harsh, acrid, mingled with the sharp scent of blood and the metallic tang of old wounds reopened. My stomach turned. I ran the opposite way, toward the work corridors that cut through the hive's understructure. Those passages were slick with coolant runoff and lined with pipes so hot they hummed. They were not meant for people. They were meant for maintenance servitors and desperate fugitives. I became the latter. My boots slipped on a patch of oil. I caught myself on a railing crusted with grime and kept going. Behind me, the bells rang again, and the footsteps, bare steel on stone, answered, steady and unhurried. They did not chase like men do, panting and swearing. They pursued like a doctrine, inevitable as gravity. I risked a glance over my shoulder at an intersection where the corridor widened. For a moment I saw movement, figures in ragged cloth, pale limbs exposed, heads bowed as they moved. They were too far to make out faces, but I saw the flash of metal in their hands, saw the way their bodies swayed with each step, as if burdened by more than flesh. The pressure in my chest doubled. My lungs burned. My heart hammered like a fist against a locked door. Mercy. I whispered without meaning to, the word tasting sour. Mercy was not a currency used here. The corridor narrowed, and the hive's machinery seemed to close in on me. Pipes sweated overhead. Steam hissed from a cracked valve, fogging my vision and scalding my cheek. The floor vibrated with distant engines, and the sound of my own breath became ragged obscene. Too loud in the claustrophobic passage. The hymn followed. I realized, as my feet splashed through coolant puddles, that they were not hunting me as a task. They were hunting me as worship. Every step they took was an act of penitence. Every heartbeat they endured was another bead on a rosary of suffering. And my fear, my frantic flight through filth and heat, was part of the ritual. I was not merely prey, I was an instrument. Hope thinned with every turn. Not because I believed they would catch me soon, but because I began to understand that catching me was never the point. They could have set alarms. They could have sealed the corridors with bulkhead doors. They could have sent enforcers to box me in. Instead, the hive stayed open, indifferent, allowing me to run because my running was the lesson. The administratum had stamped my writ in triplicate. Now the faithful were meant to read it in the language of blood and exhaustion. I pushed through a hatch marked AUTHRSDENTNANCEOLY and slammed it behind me. The latch clicked, thin and pathetic. I stumbled into darkness broken only by a flickering lumen at the far end. The air here was colder, damp, thick with the smell of mold and machine grease. Somewhere nearby, something skittered in the walls. I pressed my back to the hatch, chest heaving, and listened. The bells were distant now, muffled by layers of ferrocrete. But the hymn remained, faint and persistent, threading through the hive's bones like a prayer whispered into a dying ear. And beneath it, inexorable as fate, came that scrape, bare steel on stone, drawing nearer. One measured step at a time, I had fled my workplace. I had abandoned routine. I had broken the only fragile shield I had, and still, I had only begun to run. I learned quickly that hiding in the hive is not about disappearing. It is about becoming unremarkable enough that suffering passes you by in search of something louder. The maintenance corridor emptied into a sub-level hab ring where the ceilings dipped low and the lights flickered in penitential rhythms. This was where the labor serfs lived when they were too exhausted or too broken to make it back to assigned dormitories. Bodies slept in alcoves meant for storage. Faces stared through me with the dull patience of those who had learned that curiosity was expensive. I folded myself into them. I smeared grime on my cheeks, rubbed coolant residue into my hands until the skin burned and cracked. I tore the corner from one of my writs and used it to bind my bleeding palm, letting the ink soak into the paper until my designation dissolved into red pulp. If the Imperium was a ledger, then this was its lowest margin. Where lives were rounded down to zero, I sat cross-legged against a bulkhead beside a group of ration counters, men and women hunched over stamped metal chits like monks bent over scripture. Their fingers moved with reverent speed, sorting and stacking according to quotas posted on flaking wall slates. No one spoke. Speech wasted calories. The air was thick with breath, and the sour tang of unwashed bodies, layered beneath cheap incense, meant to suppress the stink. I picked up a stack of chits and began to count 1, 2, 3. The numbers steadied me. Each chit was stamped with a date, a work unit, a life fraction. I counted and stacked and pretended my hands were not shaking. I pretended the pressure in my chest had nothing to do with the hymn. I could still feel reverberating through the hive's bones. I pretended the scrape of bare steel was only memory, The ledger slate above us updated with a soft chime, subtracting units for spoilage, injury, loss. Loss was a broad category. It always had been. Minutes stretched, then hours. The hive does not mark time kindly in its depths. It erodes it, grinds it into sameness. I allowed myself to believe, just for a moment, that I had slipped beneath notice. That the hunt had passed me by in favor of some other sinner whose terror would suffice. That was when the screams began. They did not come from far away. They came from the corridor mouth barely 20 meters from where we sat. A single, sharp cry at first, cut off so abruptly it sounded like someone had slammed a door on a voice. The ration counters did not look up. One woman's lips moved silently, counting faster. A man beside me pressed his chits into a tighter stack, knuckles whitening. Footsteps followed, bare steel on stone. The pressure in my chest surged, stealing my breath. I stared at the floor, at the stains layered into its surface, oil, blood, rust, something darker that might have been all three combined. I could smell incense now, strong enough to sting my eyes. Beneath it was another scent, coppery and wet. They entered the hab ring without ceremony. I did not look at them directly. I could not. I saw them reflected in the dull sheen of the bulkhead, ragged robes hanging from latticed bodies, pale skin marked with old wounds and fresh ones alike. Chains wrapped around their torsos, biting into flesh with every step. In their hands, blades caught the light, simple, brutal tools, worn smooth by use and devotion. They did not acknowledge the serfs. To them the rest of us were furniture. We were the background against which their penance was enacted. The foreman who had followed me, Emperor curse his cautious heart, stood frozen at the corridor entrance. His vox, grill crackled with static as he tried to speak, to explain, to offer something in exchange for his continued breathing. One of the hunters stepped forward, head bowed, murmuring a prayer that sounded more like a confession than a threat. Then the blade sang. It was not a metaphor. The sound it made as it cut was high and keen, a whistle of metal slicing through meat and cloth. The foreman's scream burst free, raw and animal, before cutting off into a wet gargle. Blood sprayed the wall in an arc that glittered briefly in the lumen, light before dripping down in slow, patient rivulets. No one moved. I tasted bile and swallowed it back down. My hands clenched around the ration chits until their stamped edges bit into my palms. The hunters worked with practiced efficiency, carving flesh as if reading a text written only for them. The foreman's body hit the floor in pieces, twitching, already being reduced in the hive's accounting to a maintenance incident. One of them spoke then, her voice hoarse and reverent. "Shelter given," she said, "sin shared." Another answered, "Pain absolves." They did not look at me. They did not need to. The hunt was not a frantic search, it was a narrowing. They were teaching the hive what happened to those who delayed judgment. They were writing my story in other people's blood. When they left, the bells rang once, deep, satisfied, and the hymn faded into the distance like a wound closing. Only then did the hab ring exhale. Someone began to sob quietly. Another vomited into a drain without standing. The ration counters resumed their work with shaking hands, the slate above us chiming as it updated the ledger. One foreman loss. I stared at the blood pooling across the floor, seeping toward the drains cut into the stone. It moved slowly, like it did not want to leave. I understood then what my survival cost. Each step I took away from them left a debt behind. The hive paid it eagerly, because the hive always pays. It has nothing else. My soul felt itemized. I rose on unsteady legs and backed away from the group, careful not to draw attention. No one stopped me. No one met my eyes. I was already marked as misfortune. Proximity was dangerous. I slipped into another corridor, then another, moving deeper into the maze of the lower levels where records grew sparse and lights failed more often than not. The farther I went, the more the hive seemed to decay around me. Walls were cracked and patched with mismatched plates bearing scraped devotional slogans. Cogitator terminals flickered with corrupted data, their screens looping error prayers in binaric cant. The air grew colder, wetter, heavy with mold and the faint electrical tang of failing systems. I thought of turning myself in. The idea surfaced like a guilty pleasure. To step into the open, to kneel, to let the blades fall and end the running. But the image that followed was not relief. It was the foreman's face as the blade cut, the way his pain had been used to sanctify my continued breath. Surrender would not undo that. It would only conclude the lesson, so I kept moving. I hid among cargo pallets stamped with destinations that no longer existed. I crouched in disused chapels where the icons had been stripped for scrap, leaving only discolored outlines on the walls like holy ghosts. I learned to sleep in fragments, jerking awake at every imagined footstep, every creak of cooling metal, and always, somewhere beneath the hive's constant noise, I felt them. Not close enough to hear, not far enough to forget. The pressure in my chest never fully eased. It was a reminder. Steady and cruel, the hunt continued because I continued. By the time I reached the upper access ways near the shrine districts, my clothes were stiff with dried blood that was not mine. My hands smelled of rust and fear, no matter how much I scrubbed them in recycling runoff. I had become a ledger entry walking on borrowed lines, every breath balanced against another's agony. I understood now that the Imperium did not need to catch me quickly. It needed me to understand, and I did. Faith had always been a background noise to my life, like the hum of generators or the drip of leaking pipes. It was everywhere, unavoidable, but rarely personal. You bowed when told, recited when prompted, burned incense when the schedule demanded it. Faith was a lubricant for the hive's machinery, not a refuge. And yet, as I climbed toward the shrine districts with my legs trembling and my lungs raw, it was faith I reached for, not out of belief, but out of desperation. The shrine alcove I found was small, wedged between two massive buttresses that supported a transit causeway above. It was not a grand place of pilgrimage. No crowds, no relics in crystal reliquaries. Just a recessed archway with a cracked stone effigy of the god emperor, his features worn smooth by centuries of grime and neglect. Someone had left a few stub candles at the base, their wax pooled and hardened like old tears. Incense smoldered in a dented burner, failing to fully mask the stench beneath old blood, dried deep into the stone. I collapsed onto the floor and knelt, because my legs would not hold me anymore. The stone was cold through my thin trousers. I pressed my forehead to it and closed my eyes, breathing shallowly, counting heartbeats the way I had counted ration chits. For a few precious moments, the hive seemed to recede. The constant pressure in my chest loosened, just enough for me to draw a full breath without pain. I whispered a prayer I barely remembered, words learned as a child and never truly understood. They tasted strange in my mouth, like a language meant for someone else. I did not ask for salvation. I asked for stillness, for the world to stop narrowing. The bells rang, not distant this time, not muffled by walls and machinery. They tolled close enough that I felt the vibration through the stone beneath my knees. Dust drifted down from the archway with each resonant strike. My breath caught in my throat. I knew then, with a clarity sharper than fear, that sanctuaries were for the faithful, not the condemned. Footsteps approached, bare steel on stone, slow, deliberate, reverent. The hymn rose with them, no longer a distant murmur, but a raw chorus echoing through the shrine district's vaulted passages. Their voices were hoarse, stripped of melody, each word dragged up from lungs that had known smoke and screaming. It was not beautiful. It was sincere. I opened my eyes. They stood at the mouth of the alcove, silhouetted against the lumen glow of the corridor beyond. Up close, the stories had not prepared me for them. They were thinner than I expected, their bodies whittled down by fasting and flagellation. Scars crisscrossed their skin in dense, overlapping patterns, some old and white, others fresh and angry. Chains bit into flesh, links embedded so deeply they seemed part of the body rather than an adornment. Their heads were bare, hair shorn close or torn out in patches, and their eyes were empty, not vacant, not mad, empty in the way a cup is empty after being poured out completely. Whatever fear, doubt, or hesitation might once have lived there had been scarred away, replaced by purpose so absolute it left no room for anything else. One of them stepped forward. I recognized the blade in her hand from the reflection in the bulkhead days earlier, simple, brutal, its edge nicked and stained. She did not raise it. She did not threaten me. She spoke my designation. Hearing it aloud, spoken with reverence and hatred in equal measure, was worse than hearing my name scratched out on parchment. It felt like a hook driven into my spine, pinning me in place. My prayer died on my lips. "Kneeling does not absolve," she said quietly. Her voice was rough, as if every word cost her something. "Flight does not cleanse." Another voice joined hers, overlapping, then another, until my designation was being repeated by all of them in a low, rhythmic chant. It filled the alcove, pressed in on me from all sides, squeezing the air from my lungs. I understood then that kneeling meant nothing to them. They were not here to hear confession in the way priests do. They were here to enact one. I scrambled to my feet, slipping on the stone slicked with old blood and candle wax. Panic surged, hot and choking. I backed away until my shoulders hit the cold stone of the alcove's rear wall. There was nowhere else to go. The woman with the blade tilted her head, studying me not as a person but as a problem to be solved through pain. "Run," she said. The word struck me harder than any blow. Run. Permission, command. Mercy twisted into cruelty. They stepped aside, opening the corridor as if presenting a gift. The hymn faltered, then resumed, softer now, anticipatory. I did not question it. I lunged past them, my shoulder brushing against scarred flesh, my skin crawling where it made contact. No one reached for me. No one struck. I ran. The shrine district blurred around me, rows of votive candles guttering in recycled air, prayer scrolls hanging in tatters, statues with chipped faces staring blindly ahead. The smell of incense clung to me, mixing with sweat and fear. My boots slapped against stone worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims, each step echoing too loudly in the vaulted space. Behind me, the hymn followed. They did not rush. They did not need to. Their footsteps rang steady and unhurried, a counterpoint to my frantic flight. The bells tolled again, marking not hours or shifts, but stages of my unraveling. I burst through a side passage and into a maintenance stairwell, its lumen flickering erratically. The walls were close here, pressing in, smeared with grace and devotional graffiti. My breath rasped in my throat, each inhale scraping like sandpaper. My muscles screamed. Lactic acid burning through legs already abused by days of running and hiding. I reached a landing and stumbled, catching myself on a rusted railing that bit into my palm. Blood welled up, bright and warm. I stared at it for half a heartbeat, mesmerized, then smeared it across my trousers without thinking. Another mark. Another line in the ledger. The pressure in my chest intensified, a crushing weight that made stars dance at the edge of my vision. I thought of stopping, of turning around and letting the blade fall. The image of relief was seductive, almost beautiful. Then I remembered the foreman's death. The ration counters bowed heads. The way my survival had written suffering into the lives of others. Stopping now would not erase that. It would only add one more entry. So I ran again. I ran until my legs buckled and I had to crawl, dragging myself along a corridor that smelled of ozone and decay. I ran until my faith, thin and borrowed as it was, peeled away from me like dead skin. The shrine district fell behind, its icons and incense proving as hollow as everything else the Imperium offered. Somewhere behind me, I heard laughter, ragged, exultant, layered with prayer, not mockery. Joy. The joy of those who believed utterly in what they were doing. I left faith behind in that stairwell, pooling on the stone with my blood. Whatever had once told me that sanctuaries existed was a lie. There were no safe places, only delays. As I forced myself onward into the hive's deeper arteries, one thought burned brighter than fear, brighter than exhaustion. They would not stop, and neither, for now, would I. By the time the chase became ritual, my body no longer belonged to me. It was a thing dragged along by fear and habit, a failing engine driven past tolerances, because there was no shutdown protocol left to invoke. Pain was constant now, no longer sharp enough to demand attention. But everywhere, an ache threaded through muscle and bone, a grinding protest in my joints, a rawness in my lungs that turned every breath into a shallow theft. I learned their rhythms, not by choice, by necessity. They did not pursue endlessly. That was the first revelation. There were pauses, long enough for my pulse to slow, for my vision to steady, for the terrible hope of escape to creep back in. I would collapse in some forgotten junction, curled behind a stack of rusted crates or wedged between heat-bleached pipes, and I would listen. The hymn would fade. The bells would fall silent. The pressure in my chest would loosen, just a fraction. That was when they scourged themselves. I heard it through walls and vents. The wet sound of flesh struck by chain and blade, the sharp intakes of breath, that were not screams but something closer to gratitude. Their prayers changed during these intervals, no longer focused on pursuit, but on failure, on inadequacy, on the sin of not catching me quickly enough. "I am unworthy," one voice rasped, carried through a ventilation grate slick with condensation. "Make me sharp," another begged. The words lodged in my skull and would not leave. Every pause in the chase was not mercy, it was penance. They were punishing themselves for allowing me to live, even briefly. And when they resumed, their footsteps carried renewed certainty, as if my continued existence had been hammered into them as proof of their own impurity. Each step they took after that was heavier. I crawled through the hive's forgotten arteries, spaces that had not seen maintenance crews in generations. The walls were layered with flaking paint, and older warnings half scraped away, their letters ghosting through newer coats like buried accusations. Pipes groaned and knocked as fluids moved sluggishly through them, each sound making me flinch. The air was hot in some places, freezing in others. The climate controls long since surrendered to entropy. I listened through grates, through floor plates, through the hive's bones themselves. The scrape of bare steel returned every time, steady and patient, never hurried, never lost. Once I dared to look. I had wedged myself into a service crawl space above a transit corridor, my cheek pressed against cold metal, my breath shallow enough to make my lungs scream. Below me, they passed in single file. I saw them clearly then, no reflection to soften the truth. Their bodies were crisscrossed with fresh wounds, blood still wet and shining. Some walked with limps, dragging damaged legs that would never properly heal. One supported another with an arm slung around her shoulders, their blood mingling as it dripped onto the stone. They were smiling, not wide, joyful smiles, but small ones, private and serene. The smiles of those who had surrendered every doubt and found peace in suffering. Their eyes were half-lidded, unfocused on the world around them, fixed inward on something I could not see. I pressed a fist into my mouth to keep from retching. They passed beneath me, the hymn murmured low, intimate now, words of confession, words of devotion, words that named my terror as sacred fuel. When they were gone, I lay there shaking, the metal vibrating faintly beneath me, as if the hive itself had registered their passage. Envy crept in then. I hated myself for it, but it came all the same. I envied their certainty, their absolute conviction that every wound had meaning, that every step led closer to redemption. I envied the way they did not hesitate, did not question. The Imperium had given them a story that made sense of their pain, and they clung to it with bloodied hands. I had no such story. I was running because I was afraid. I was hiding because instinct screamed that life, even like this, was preferable to the blade. There was no nobility in it, no sanctification, just animal persistence stretched thin by exhaustion. The chase pressed on. My body began to fail in small, humiliating ways. My hands shook uncontrollably, making it difficult to grip ladders or haul myself through hatches. My vision blurred at the edges, dark spots blooming when I stood too quickly. Once, my legs simply refused to obey, buckling beneath me without warning. I lay on my side in a corridor slick with oil and cried, the sound torn from me before I could stop it. The hymn answered, not louder, closer. I forced myself up, dragging one foot behind the other, leaving a faint smear of blood where a wound had reopened. Blood marked my path now in ways I could not fully control. I imagined them following it with reverence, each drop a bead on their rosary, each smear a sign that the rite was progressing as intended. I began to hallucinate from lack of sleep. Faces appeared in rust patterns on the walls, mouths open in silent accusation. The hum of generators twisted into whispers that spoke my designation over and over again. Even when the bells were silent, I heard them tolling inside my skull, each imagined strike compressing my thoughts further. Time lost meaning. I measured it in heartbeats, in the intervals between hymns, in the distance I could put between myself and the sound of bare steel before my legs failed again. The hive above and below blurred into an endless warren of suffering, every level a variation on the same decay. At some point, I realized I was no longer hoping to escape. I was hoping to last. That shift frightened me more than anything else. Escape had been a fantasy, fragile but bright. Endurance was something else entirely, a grinding acceptance that this was my world now, that the chase would define every remaining moment of my life until it ended in blood and confession. The pressure in my chest became constant, no longer spiking with proximity, but settling into a permanent weight. Breathing felt like working against a vice. My ribs ached. My heart fluttered erratically, sometimes skipping beats long enough to make me wonder if it would simply stop out of spite. Still, they did not close in. They let me rest just long enough to believe I might collapse without them watching. Then the footsteps would return, and I would drag myself onward again, my muscles screaming, my mind fraying. I understood then that the chase itself was the sacrament. Not the kill, not even the capture. The pursuit was the prayer, and my suffering was the incense burned to carry it upward. Every step I took renewed their vows. Every breath I drew was an offense they sought to erase through motion and pain. The hive felt heavier with every level I descended, as if the ceiling pressed down in sympathy with my despair. The walls seemed closer, the air thicker. I began to envy the dead whose names were reduced to maintenance losses and ledger errors. They had finished their part, I had not. Somewhere ahead, I knew. Pain waited that would clarify everything, a wound deep enough to cut through fear and exhaustion alike. I did not know when it would come, only that it would be deliberate. The chase had become right, and I was its offering. The blade found me in a place so mundane it felt like mockery. I had collapsed in a freight transfer tunnel, one of those half-forgotten arteries that existed solely because removing it from the hive's schematics would have required a dozen counter-signatures no one was willing to provide. The walls were ribbed with reinforcement struts, each stamped with devotional serials, so worn they had become abstract patterns. Condensation dripped steadily from overhead pipes, striking the deck with a hollow plink that marked time more faithfully than any bell. I lay there on my side, cheek pressed to cold metal, my breath coming in ragged shudders. My legs were numb below the knees, pins and needles blooming painfully whenever I tried to move them. I had pushed myself past every warning my body could give. This was not rest. This was failure disguised as stillness. The pressure in my chest intensified, not suddenly, not violently, but with the awful inevitability of a tide returning. I knew they were close before I heard them. My heart began to hammer, then stutter, as if unsure whether it was worth continuing. Bare steel scraped stone. I did not scream. I did not run. There was nowhere to go, and some dim, broken part of me understood that this moment had been scheduled long before my writ was stamped. I rolled onto my stomach and tried to crawl, fingers clawing uselessly at the slick floor. Each movement sent knives of pain through my hips and spine. A shadow fell over me. The hymn was quiet now, almost gentle, murmured close enough that I could hear individual breaths between the words. The air smelled of incense and blood, thick enough to coat my tongue. I squeezed my eyes shut and waited for the end. The pain came, but not as I expected. The blade kissed my back, just below the shoulder, shallow and precise. A line of fire carved across my skin, hot and immediate, so sharp it stole the air from my lungs in a single silent gasp. My body convulsed, a reflexive arch that sent agony radiating outward in bright, blinding waves. I screamed then. The sound tore out of me, raw and uncontrolled, echoing down the empty tunnel. It felt like something was being pulled loose from inside my chest along with it. Something knotted tight for days finally ripped free. The blade withdrew. I lay there trembling, blood pooling beneath me, warm and slick against the cold deck. The pain did not fade. It intensified, spreading, clarifying everything. The world narrowed to sensation, the burn of the wound, the rasp of my breath, the frantic thud of my heart. Thoughts stripped away under the pressure until only awareness remained. I felt them around me, close enough that their shadows overlapped mine. Not yet, one of them said softly. Hands grabbed my coat and hauled me upright with surprising gentleness. I sagged between them, my legs barely supporting my weight. The wound on my back throbbed in time with my heartbeat, each pulse sending fresh spikes of pain through my nerves. Blood soaked my clothes, clinging to fabric and skin alike, sticky and insistent. They turned me toward the lumen light, forcing me to stand. I squinted, vision swimming, and saw them properly for the first time at arm's length. Their faces were gaunt, cheeks hollowed by fasting. Sweat and blood streaked their skin, catching in the lines carved by old scars. Their eyes were bright now, feverish, fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. The one who had cut me met my gaze. Her lips trembled, not with doubt, but with emotion held barely in check. "Learn," she whispered. Then they stepped back. They did not finish it. They did not bind me. They did not even watch as I staggered and fell to my knees, clutching at my back, fingers coming away slick and red. They turned as one and walked away down the tunnel, the scrape of bare steel receding, the hymn swelling briefly before fading once more into the hive's vastness. They had wounded me, and they had let me go. Understanding dawned slowly, painfully, like a bruise blooming across my mind. This was instruction. Pain applied carefully, deliberately, to strip away illusion. They had not struck to kill. They had struck to teach me what they believed suffering was meant to do. The pain clarified everything. Fear receded, pushed aside by sensation so intense it left no room for panic. I was too busy staying conscious, too busy breathing, to imagine escape or surrender. Each inhale scraped raw against my throat. Each exhale came out as a whimper I could not suppress. I dragged myself back against the wall and sat there, shaking uncontrollably. Blood ran down my side, soaking into my trousers and pooling on the floor beneath me. I pressed a trembling hand against the wound, gasping as my fingers sank into torn flesh. It was not deep, not mortal. They knew exactly how much to take. I laughed then, a broken, hysterical sound that echoed strangely in the empty tunnel. The absurdity of it struck me like another blow. They had hurt me not to end my suffering, but to refine it, to make it more focused, more meaningful. I tore a strip from my shirt with my teeth and wrapped it clumsily around my torso, biting down on fabric to stifle screams as the makeshift bandage tightened. The pressure helped, dulling the worst of the pain into a constant, grinding ache. Blood still seeped through, staining the cloth dark. When I stood, the world tilted dangerously. I leaned against the wall until the spinning eased, then forced myself forward. Each step sent jolts of agony through my back, my muscles protesting violently. My legs threatened to give out, but I moved them anyway, one after the other, leaving a trail behind me that even a blind man could follow. Blood marked my path like ink on parchment. I became acutely aware of my own body in a way I never had before. The weight of my limbs, the stiffness of my joints, the way pain traveled along nerves like messages sent too quickly. There was no room left for abstraction, no space for hope or despair, only the next step, and the next breath. They followed, not immediately. They let the lesson settle. They allowed the pain to mature, to sink deep enough that it could not be forgotten. When the footsteps returned, they were distant, respectful. The scrape of bare steel sounded almost approving now, as if I had finally begun to speak a language they understood. I staggered through corridors that blurred together, barely registering where I was going. The hive seemed quieter, or perhaps my hearing had narrowed like everything else. Even the bells sounded muffled, distant. At one point, I caught my reflection in a polished panel, a maintenance sign buffed smooth by countless hands. I barely recognized myself. My face was gray, eyes sunken and wild. Blood crusted along my collar and sleeve. I looked like something already halfway dead, animated only by stubborn refusal to stop. Something inside me shifted then. Not acceptance, not faith, something harder and uglier. An understanding that the pain was not a deviation from the hunt, it was its natural progression. This was how it would continue: measured wounds, escalating instruction, each injury stripping away another layer of resistance until nothing remained but confession and flesh. They were shaping me, and I was learning. By the time the manufactorum lights began to glow ahead, their harsh orange glare bleeding through the haze of my vision, I could barely feel my legs. My back burned with every movement, the wound throbbing like a second heart. The air grew hotter, thicker with smoke and oil, the roar of massive machines vibrating through the soles of my boots. I knew then that I was running out of places to hide. The hive was funneling me somewhere specific, whether by design or simple exhaustion. Open spaces, bright lights, no shadows, no more lessons left to teach with restraint. The manufactorum did not welcome me. It swallowed me. I emerged from the access corridor into a cathedral of industry, so vast it stole what little breath I had left. The ceiling vanished into smoke and heat shimmer, lost somewhere above the gantries and prayer cranes that crawled along rails like mechanical insects. Rows of furnaces roared in disciplined fury, their mouths glowing white-hot, fed by conveyor lines laden with raw ore, scrap, and sometimes things that were not clearly either. The air was thick with ash and oil, each inhale scraping my lungs raw and carrying the taste of metal and burned flesh. The noise was overwhelming. Massive presses slammed down in steady, bone-shaking rhythms. Pistons hissed, gears screamed, Vox chanters mounted on pylons barked litanies of productivity and devotion, their voices distorted by age and heat. It should have drowned everything else out. It did not drown out the footsteps. I staggered forward, half blinded by the glare, clutching at my back as another wave of pain rolled through me. Blood had soaked through my makeshift bandage, slick against my skin, cooling and tightening as it dried. Every movement felt like tearing something open that should have been left alone. My legs trembled violently, muscles fluttering with exhaustion, threatening to give out entirely. Workers moved around me without slowing. They wore heat, shields and respirators, their faces hidden behind cracked visors streaked with soot. They operated consoles, hauled chains, guided massive loads into place with practiced motions. I screamed as I stumbled between two conveyor lines, my voice raw and cracked, but no one turned. Whether they did not hear me over the machinery or chose not to made no difference. In the manufactorum, suffering is ambient noise. I fell to my knees near the base of a furnace tower, the heat blistering my face, sweat evaporating as fast as it formed. The floor vibrated constantly, a relentless tremor that rattled my bones. I tried to push myself up and failed. My arms buckled, strength gone, palms slapping uselessly against metal grating slick with oil and ash. The pressure in my chest was immense now, a crushing certainty that stole more air than pain ever had. My heart hammered erratically, fluttering like it might tear itself apart just to escape this body. The footsteps came closer, bare steel on metal now, the scrape sharper, more pronounced against the grated floor. The sound cut through the industrial roar with terrible clarity, as if the hive itself were making room for it. Workers nearest to me stepped aside without looking, creating a widening circle of empty space. A foreman on a raised platform noticed the disturbance and raised a hand to signal a halt, then froze as he saw what approached. The hymn rose, echoing strangely in the vast space, voices thin but unbreakable against the thunder of machinery. The sound of it made my vision blur. I tasted salt and iron and realized I was crying, tears streaking down my grime-caked face only to vanish in the heat. They emerged from the smoke like figures from a fever dream. Up close, under the harsh manufactorum lights, they looked less human than ever. Their scars stood out starkly against reddened skin, some wounds still bleeding freely, others sealed crudely with prayer, knots and strips of cloth. Chains clinked softly with each step, embedded links tearing open scabs anew. Their blades were dark with dried blood, edges gleaming dully. They surrounded me in a loose circle, careful not to step too close to the furnace's heat plume. The workers watched from a distance, faces hidden, bodies still. The machines continued their labor, indifferent witnesses to yet another sanctioned death. I felt very small then. Not physically, though I was curled in on myself, shaking but existentially, like an entry in a ledger reduced to its final line. My designation hovered in my thoughts, no longer a string of numbers but a verdict etched into every nerve. I had run out of corridors, run out of shadows, run out of lies I could tell myself about escape. One of them stepped forward. I recognized her immediately, the one who had cut me. Her blade hung loosely at her side, tip almost brushing the floor. She looked down at me, eyes alight with something that might once have been compassion long ago, before it had been refined into purpose. "You are empty," she said, not unkindly. Good. My mouth opened. No sound came out at first. When it did, it was a broken croak. "Please." The word fell uselessly between us, evaporating in the heat. Another voice answered, overlapping hers. "The account is nearly balanced." They began to chant again, but now the words were different, slower, measured, a litany of confession and cost. Each line named something taken: flesh, breath, fear, time. Each response affirmed its necessity. I tried to stand one last time. My legs screamed in protest, muscles locking, then buckling completely. I collapsed forward, catching myself on my hands, palms burning against the hot grating. Pain flared white, hot through my back as the wound pulled open further. I cried out, the sound swallowed by the machines. Hands seized my arms, hauling me upright with relentless strength. I dangled between them, barely able to support my own weight. My head lolled forward, chin hitting my chest. Blood dripped steadily from my back, hissing faintly as it struck the heated floor. I was exhausted beyond fear. That, I realized, was the final cruelty. Not terror, not agony, but depletion. There was nothing left in me to bargain with, no reserve of strength or faith or hatred. Only the bare fact of my existence, stripped down to breath and heartbeat. The chant stopped. Silence fell in the circle around me, not absolute silence, but a pocket of it, carved out of the industrial din. Even the machines seemed distant, muffled, as if the world were leaning in to listen. I was turned, forced to face the one with the blade. She raised it then, slowly, reverently, the metal catching the furnace light and throwing it back into my eyes. I saw myself reflected there, hollow-eyed, blood-soaked, barely upright. I understood, finally, what fulfillment meant to them. Not mercy, not justice, completion. This was the place where the chase ended, not because I had been caught, but because there was nowhere left inside me to run. My body had been audited down to its last function. My fear had been harvested. My pain recorded. All that remained was confession. The hymn began again, quiet and intimate, and the blade hovered at the edge of my vision, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from the metal. I drew a ragged breath. Every inhale a victory snatched from the furnace air, and knew that the next words I spoke would be the last ones that mattered. They did not kill me immediately. That was the final lesson. They dragged me away from the furnace's glare to a service days. At the edge of the manufactorum floor, a raised slab of scorched plasteel used for inspections and disciplinary rites. The heat was less oppressive there, but the air was still thick with smoke and incense, heavy enough that each breath felt borrowed. My legs no longer responded. They folded beneath me, and I was lowered, carefully, reverently, onto my knees. Someone bound my wrists behind my back with chain. The metal was cold against my skin, biting as it tightened. Each link clicked into place with ceremonial precision. I felt smaller with every sound, reduced not by force but by inevitability. The chain was not meant to restrain me. I could barely move anyway. It was meant to signify that I had reached the final stage. The chant ceased. In its place came silence, true silence this time, carved cleanly out of the manufactorum's roar. I could still hear the machines, but they felt distant, unreal, like something happening in another life. All that mattered now was the circle around me, the heat of bodies scarred and bleeding, the weight of expectation pressing down harder than the hive ever had. The one with the blade knelt before me. Up close, I could see the fine tremor in her hands, not fear, not hesitation, but intensity held at the brink. Her face was a map of pain endured willingly. Old lash marks crossed her cheeks, fresh cuts still wept along her jawline. Her eyes locked onto mine with unwavering focus. "Confess," she said. The words struck deeper than the blade ever had. "What?" I whispered. My throat felt flayed raw, each syllable scraping past torn flesh. "What do you want me to say?" "Everything," she replied. "Truth lies. Guilt given, guilt taken. Speak until nothing remains." They leaned closer as one, their presence enclosing me. I could smell them clearly now: sweat, blood, incense, iron. The scent of human suffering refined into devotion. I understood then that this was not interrogation. It was extraction. I began to speak. I confessed to crimes I remembered and crimes I invented. I confessed to laziness, to envy, to resentment of overseers and hatred of quotas. I confessed to skipping prayer cycles, to doubting the God-Emperor's plan in moments of exhaustion. I confessed to thoughts I had never voiced, thoughts I had barely admitted to myself. That life in the hive felt pointless. That suffering seemed arbitrary. That faith often felt like a lie told too often to question. Each confession was met with murmured affirmation. Accepted. Counted. Necessary. When my voice faltered, they prompted me. When I ran out of words, they supplied accusations for me to agree with. Truth became irrelevant. What mattered was the act of surrender, the stripping away of self until nothing but raw admission remained. My throat burned. My vision swam. I tasted blood where my tongue split from dryness and strain. Still, they did not stop me. I spoke of the foreman's death, sobbing now, the sound humiliating and wet. I spoke of the ration counters, of hiding among them while others paid the price for my survival. I spoke of the shrine, of kneeling in false hope. I spoke of running, not bravely, not cleverly, but desperately, selfishly. Yes, one of them whispered, voice thick with reverence. That is the shape of it. I realized then that my fear was not an obstacle to them. It was the final offering. Every tremor in my voice, every broken sob, fed something in them that prayer alone could not. They did not want me brave. They wanted me honest in my terror, when my voice finally failed completely. When all that came out were hoarse gasps and broken sounds, they let the silence stretch. The pressure in my chest eased, not because I was calm, but because there was nothing left inside me to compress. The blade rose. I watched it with distant clarity. The metal was nicked and scarred, its surface dulled by countless uses, yet it caught the light beautifully. I saw my reflection in it, eyes hollow, face streaked with grime and tears, mouth slack with exhaustion. I barely recognized myself. In that moment, I understood my final utility. I was not being killed as punishment. I was being completed. My death would not erase my sins. It would justify the pain they had endured in pursuing me. It would close their ledger, balance their accounts, sanctify their wounds. My fear had carried them here. The blade hovered, trembling slightly. "Do you accept this end?" she asked. I should have screamed. I should have begged. I should have cursed them, cursed the hive, cursed the Imperium that had reduced my life to a moving lesson in pain. Instead, I nodded. It was not courage. It was emptiness. Yes, I breathed. The blade fell. Pain exploded through me, white and absolute, a final clarity so complete it erased everything else. There was no time to scream, no time to think, just sensation then release. The pressure in my chest vanished entirely, replaced by a sudden, terrible lightness. As I died, I felt their relief wash over me like warmth. I felt their prayers conclude, satisfied. My blood struck the floor, and I knew somehow that it would be cleaned, logged, and forgotten within the cycle. Another loss recorded. Another lesson taught. The hunt ended. Silence followed, deep and final. And then there was nothing left to remember me at all.